Good to see everyone tonight. We're going to hit chapters 38 and 39 tonight. 38 we're not going to dwell in much. If you've read that one, you know the story. And we'll talk about it a little bit, draw some conclusions, and spend most of our time in chapter 39. But if you would, join me in prayer as we start. Father, we just thank you for a beautiful day, and just thank you for being with us and getting us through it. We thank you for the way you provide for us, the way you take care of us, the way you bless us. And we just pray that you would just be with us tonight as we study your word. Help us to learn, help us to apply. And we thank you for all you do for us again. For it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. What's up with it being 100 degrees? You native Nevadians? Huh? Autumn, yeah. Kind of like Texas autumn. Texas got fooled a couple of weeks ago by thinking it was going to cool off kind of like we did. Did not happen long. Okay, we're in chapter 38, and this is a pitiful story. It's another one of these sad stories that God included for us in his book. And if you're not familiar with this story, it's a story about Jacob, or Israel's son Judah, and how he strayed away. It's important because who's Judah besides being Jacob's son? Who's a descendant of Judah? Who's the lion of Judah? So it's kind of important that we have this story in this book, and because he's the beginning of the royal line. David eventually comes from Judah. Solomon comes from David, and so on until Jesus is born in the town of David from the tribe of Judah. One of the cool things I think that Genesis shows us real well is the people, the patriarchs of our faith, were just humans. They messed up, just like we mess up. But God was still able to use them to accomplish his purposes. The difference for us is we have the Holy Spirit living in us. We have the Word of God to instruct us. And so we still mess up, but God is there to help us get right when we do. He forgives us, and he continues to use people who are not perfect. He does not use people who we would think doesn't necessarily use people who we think are superstar Christians. And if you pay attention to the news, there's been several superstar type Christians that have fallen in the last 3 or 4 months. And it's sad. It's really sad. But for us, we can have absolute confidence of God's forgiveness, and regardless of what we do, regardless of how we mess up. But he will forgive us and can still use us. A few interesting things about this chapter, and I'm not going to read this because it's a relatively short chapter, but it's also got it's got some stuff in it that I'd prefer not to read. But just some interesting side notes is in the old days, several years back, the commentaries that were wrote on Genesis did not mention this chapter at all because of the subject content in it. There were preachers who would not read this chapter aloud in their church because of what the subject content was. They encouraged people to read it at their own and draw their own conclusions. But one thing the chapter does deal with, and we talked a lot about this during the book of Revelation study. We will talk about it as we go through. We've talked about it so far in Genesis. We will talk about it until we finish Genesis. It does speak to the sovereignty of God and how God's plan, God's purposes will continue, regardless of how we or people mess up. One of the things we have to remember about the book of Genesis, it was written basically to record the origin and the development of the Israelites, the family of Jacob, the family of Israel. The Israelites went into Egypt, as we'll read in just a few chapters, a very small group of people. Now we know, because we went through Exodus last year with Pastor Calvin, that they left Egypt with a great many people, in excess of over 1 million people. And so this history is very important for them as they go from a people who did oral tradition, oral history, to a written history to teach their kids, to teach their grandchildren, and so forth. So it's really an important story in this book, and it's going to give us a few lessons to draw from. If you read this chapter, do y'all want me to read it? I don't mind reading it. I'm not embarrassed to read it. Okay, I'll read it. All right, chapter 38. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite whose name was Hirah. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up an offspring for your brother." Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so he went into his brother's wife, and he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give her an offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the Lord's sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought, "I'm afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. The wife of Judah died, and when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up with his sheep to the sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Adulamite. It was told to Tamar, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat at the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me, that you may come into me?" He said, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." She said, "Moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it?" He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she said, "Your seal, your cord, your staff, and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put her on widow's garments. And when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of the place, saying, "Where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim?" But they said, "There has been no temple prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I did not find her. Furthermore, the men of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep the things, otherwise we will become the laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry." And then Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "I'm with child by the man whom these things belong. Please examine and see whose signet ring, cords, and staff are these." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. It came about at time she was giving birth, and behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his wrist, saying, 'This one came out first.' But it came about as he drew back his hand, and behold, his brother came out. Then she said, 'What a breach you have made for yourself.' So she named him Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Zerah." What a story. What a story. Several things to note in this, and just kind of go through the story. It starts with Judah leaving home. He left his home in, where were they living? Hebron, and went out on his own down into Canaan. We're told he marries a Canaanite woman, and they started having children together. Now, what is wrong with this, you might ask? Well, if you remember, both Abraham and Isaac went to great lengths to have their boys not marry the pagan Canaanite women. You remember that Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac back to his home country, or Haran, and then Jacob and Rebekah both, Isaac sent Jacob back to the same place to find his wife. They did not want their sons marrying these pagan women so that their sons would not be tempted to compromise and hinder the covenant that God made with Abraham. So they looked other places for wives. So my question is, why didn't Jacob say something? Either Jacob couldn't stop him. Of course, he's a grown man. Judah's a grown man. Or he was indifferent. Just my opinion, based on everything we've read about Jacob up to this point, he was probably indifferent. More concerned about himself than he was his sons. And so, as this happens, the consequences of this chapter start to play out. As we read, Judah marries this woman. They have 3 sons in succession. And as per the custom of the day, Judah finds a son for the oldest, which is a Canaanite girl named Tamar. And even apparently was not a very good man, not a very nice man, not a very moral man. As we were told, he was evil in God's sight, so God took him out. The custom of the day was that for brothers, if the oldest brother's wife died, then any of the brothers' wives died, the other brothers had to sleep with their wife, the widow, and give a son or give a child, if she was childless, so that she could have children. So that's kind of what's going on here. And so Judah goes, after God took out, Judah goes to his second-born son, Onan, and asks him to sleep with Tamar so that she could have a child to carry on Er's lineage. Onan didn't want any part of that, having a child that wasn't going to be part of his household. So he practiced an ancient form of birth control so that Tamar would not get pregnant. Onan, God considered Onan evil in his sight, and God took him out too. So Judah's out of sons of age, so he tells Tamar to move back in with her father and to remain a widow, and when the next son, which is Shelah, is of age, she can sleep with him. But Judah is also afraid that Shelah might be put to death as well, so he's in no hurry for him to sleep with Tamar. So Tamar goes back to her people. One of the superstitions of ancient days was that if a woman's husband passes away unexpectedly, she was a witch and had put a curse on him. And Judah didn't want to take any chances with his last son in with this woman. Well, as we read, after some time passed, Judah's wife dies, and after the proper time of mourning, he's going to go down to the sheep shearing place with his buddy Abdullah, the Adullamite. And Tamar hears about this, and she's still a widow, still waiting for Judah to come through with his promise for a son, one of his sons, to sleep with her. And so she comes up with a plan. She's going to take off her widow's black or whatever the garment was at that time, and she's going to dress up like a prostitute and sit by the gate as Judah passes by. Now, what does she know about Judah that would make her do this thinking that would trap him? Was he accustomed to going to prostitutes? Don't know. But anyway, she had a good plan in mind, and so they meet up, they negotiate a little bit, and he ends up giving her signet ring, his cord, which was a cord that went around his garment, and his staff. And he goes on to the sheep shearing station. She takes off her clothes, clothes like a prostitute, goes back to her dad's home, dresses like a widow again, and everybody's happy. But when Judah tries to deliver the goat as payment to get his cord, his ring, and his staff back, she's not there. And this is his friend, the Adullamite, again doing this for him. They look for the girl, and nobody says there's not been a prostitute here. They have no idea what they're talking about. And so Abdullamite, what's his name? What's his name? Getting the right chapter here. Flip the page. Hurrah. So Hurrah goes back to back to Judah and tells him, can't find the girl. Judah basically says no harm, no foul. And everybody's goes on living. 3 months later, word comes to Judah that his daughter-in-law is pregnant. She's been playing the prostitute. And so she's pregnant. So he becomes inflamed. Again, remember, she's had 2 husbands die, or 2 of his boys die, so they think she's a witch. So what does he want to do? He wants to burn her. So he sends word, and he wants her put to death. And then Tamar plays her cards. She sends the ring, the cord, and the staff back to Judah and says, the man who owns this is who I'm pregnant by. Well, Judah pretty much realizes he's in the wrong, as he did not give her Shelah as promised. And then a few months later, Tamar gives birth to twins named Perez and Zerah. If you open your Bible to Matthew chapter 1, if you want to flip over there real quick, this is interesting. Chapter 1, look down at verses 3 and 4. This is the lineage, the genealogy of Jesus. Judah was the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar. This Canaanite pagan woman was however many greats grandmother of Jesus' earthly father, Joseph. So, see, kind of an important story, just based on that. She is one of the 4 Gentile women who are in the line of Jesus. But this is a very sad story, but because it is a history of the Israelite people, it is very important to them, as it is for us as Christ followers. So, got a few applications from this. We've already talked about how God uses imperfect people to accomplish His plan and purposes. Like I said, this is great news for us, because we've all messed up. And then there's more to this story. It talks to us about the dangers of having the wrong kind of friends. In our story, Judah becomes friends with Hirah, who is a Canaanite, who is a pagan. Hirah introduces him to Shua, who Judah marries. He's also the friend that's going with him to the sheep shearing station. He's also the friend that Judah sends back to pay the prostitute. The old adage is true, folks. Whether you say it like this, if you play with pigs, you're going to get dirty. Or what we say at home, if you run with dogs, you go get fleas. We have to be very careful who our close friends are, as they can and oftentimes do influence us to be better followers of Christ. Or they can do just the opposite. They can get us to compromise our faith in doing things with them that we should not be doing. Now, I'm not saying we should not have non-Christian friends. Please hear me say that. We should have friends of all people. But what I am saying is the people that you allow to influence you, we need to be very careful with. I have some really pretty rough friends back home. I do. Some guys that they go to church, but their walk with God is not where it should be. Going to church is more for social purposes than it is about spiritual growth for them. And they're good friends. I enjoy being with them. Prayerfully and hopefully, I've influenced them more than they've influenced me. But we still need to be very aware of who we choose and allow to be our close friends. Another thing this story shows is the dangers of compromise. Judah gave up living with his dad and his clan, chose to go off on his own and live in Canaan. And he was living somewhere he shouldn't have been living. He married a woman he shouldn't have married. And for us, we need to understand when we're in places we should not be, it's very easy for us to compromise our faith and do the wrong things we would not normally do. Sort of like the old joke about the guy that walked into the doctor's office with his arm all mangled, and he said, "Doc, I broke my arm in 3 places." The doctor says, "Well, stay out of those 3 places." You know, there's places that we just don't need to go. And I hope that we have learned our tendencies to be in places or seeing things or reading things or watching things that are tempting, that Satan uses to tempt us. We have to know what our weak points are. As we mature in our faith, we should really know this, because we all have different points of temptation. And we need to be aware of those. And just like the doctor said, don't go to those places. Well, sometimes you just have to stay away from things, whether it's a physical place. It may be turning the television off, turning the computer off, putting your phone up, or whatever it may be. Sometimes we just need to say no. As James tells us in chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, temptation to sin starts in our head, and if it's not checked, it spreads like a cancer to your thoughts and eventually to your actions. We must be on guard and shun places we know God does not want us to go, and be very aware of the temptation when temptation starts to rattle around in our heads. The latter is much easier said than done. But we need to be aware and not engage in the temptation thoughts that Satan throws at us. The other last point we're going to see, and it's a contrast. It's a contrast to the way Judah behaved with the prostitute, in a contrast to what we're going to see Joseph go through in the next chapter. So, quick little chapter. We're probably going to do 2 a night, unless we get to a really long chapter. We are going to finish Genesis, God willing, and we will pick something else to study to finish the rest of the semester. But then you get into chapter 39, we get back to Joseph. And it starts to get exciting as we are familiar with Joseph's story and how it played out. And it's going to get good. We're going to get to see God's hand all the way through the rest of the book and how he used Joseph, how his plan to save Joseph's family worked all out. But let's talk a little bit about Egypt before we get into reading the text. At this time, Egypt was primarily made up of a bunch of little bitty villages built up and down the Nile River. The rains that they got and the abilities that they had to use the Nile for irrigation made them very good farmers, made them very good at grazing sheep, cattle, whatever they may have had. There were also large cities, as we know, and these large cities were built around temples to their gods. For the most part, Egypt was a country that was shackled, for the most part, by religious superstition and fear of angering their gods. It is believed that at this time they had over 2,000 gods, including Pharaoh himself being considered a god. Their special emphasis of their religious system was preparing for the afterlife, where they thought would be judged by their god Osiris. This was a country devoted to death as it was as much to living. As we know, they were great builders, built some amazing buildings. Anybody ever been to Egypt, seen the pyramids and all that? Something I always wanted to do, never got to. I thought, well, one of my times in flying back from Africa back home or flying to Africa, we'll stop in Egypt. Didn't happen. Every time we got on a plane and come back home, we were ready to get home. But they were great builders, and most of the people that built the great buildings were slaves. These include foreigners as much as it did some of their own people. And most people lived in mud huts. These projects were made of massive stones, as we know. And this kind of sets the setting for Joseph being in Egypt. Now, Joseph, as we know from the last chapter, was bought by a very powerful man. His name was Potiphar. Potiphar was the captain of Pharaoh's guards and was the chief executioner in Egypt. Joseph was very fortunate to have been bought by Potiphar, because Potiphar made Joseph a household slave and not a field slave. While being a slave in either place is not easy, he had it a lot easier being inside and working around the house than had he been hauling a 4-ton stone of limestone up a ramp to build a pyramid. A lot of the slaves that built their structures ended up being killed or were killed because of the heat and the harshness of their slave masters. So Joseph is going to be life is going to be a lot easier, and let's just read it. It's not that long of a chapter. Chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down here. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now the master saw the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. He made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about from that time he made him overseer in his house, and over all he owned the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge. And with him there did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked at him with desire and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the men of the household and said to them, "See, he has brought a Hebrew to make sport of us. He came in to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he fled. He left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. So he left his garment beside her until his master. So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came into me to make sport of me. As I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did," his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him in jail, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made prosper. What a story. Verse 2 tells us the Lord was with Joseph. Whatever he touched, whatever he did, was successful. His success, his blessing, being blessed, was noted by Potiphar, who picked up on it and made him his personal servant, and eventually put Joseph over everything he owned, his household. And from that time, Potiphar's household flourished, as God was with Joseph and blessed all that he was doing. Potiphar trusted Joseph so much, he put everything he owned under Joseph's authority. As I read this, a passage came to mind. It's Matthew 25:21, where God's parable of the servants, of the stewards, and God says, "Well done, my good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things, I will put you in charge of many things." And this is Joseph. He was faithful, continued to trust God, and God was blessing him. Now, Joseph was probably in his early to mid-20s at this point. The Bible tells us he was very handsome, fine specimen of manhood. This became a problem for Potiphar's wife, as she began to notice his good looks, his physique, and wanted him. One of the things we'll talk about more later is when we are being blessed by God, there will continue to be temptation knocking at the door. This was certainly the case here with Potiphar's wife, and just something interesting. What's her name? All we know her by is Potiphar's wife. The Bible doesn't even tell us who she was. Potiphar's wife. And I'm sure that she thought that since Joseph was a slave and she was his master's wife, he had to do whatever she told him to do. Verse 8, we see Joseph being very determined and very emphatic in saying no. He would not violate the trust that Potiphar had in him, and doing what she asked would also be a sin against God. Undeterred by Joseph's emphatic no, she continues to chase him. Her being turned down all the time must have probably made her very angry. So this time she laid a trap. She had all the men of the house leave, and she got along with Joseph and tried to get him to lay down. with her, and he said no again, and she grabbed him by the coat, jacket, whatever he had on, and she held on, and he took off running. And he probably ran out of the house either naked or almost naked while she screamed. Of course, everybody believed her side of the story, but not quite sure Potiphar bought it all hook, line, and sinker. After all, this guy was the chief, one of the high dogs in Egypt. He was the chief executioner. He could have had Joseph executed. But he probably knew his wife well enough to say, not sure about this story. So she had him thrown in jail instead. An interesting thing to note in this is Joseph lost another garment. He had already lost his coat of many colors. Now he lost another garment. And in this, we know the rest of the chapter. He ends up in prison. Once again, the Lord's with Joseph. Whatever Joseph touches, whatever Joseph manages, whatever he does, the Lord is with him and blesses him and takes care of him. And the jailer puts Joseph in charge of everything in the prison. So there's a lot of stuff to kind of unpack in this. So we're going to take the rest of our time looking at application points. It's quite a few. First thing we need to take away from this is God prospers those who walk in obedience. This is not the health and wealth falsehood that's been going around for many years, but actually a lesson that the Bible teaches repeatedly. God was with Joseph. God blessed Joseph. God blessed Joseph's work, made it succeed, made it prosperous. We can also see Joseph landing on his feet in every situation he's been in. Like we said, he could have been a field slave. Potiphar could have had him executed. Potiphar could have had him sent to work on the pyramids or whatever they were building at the time, where he probably would not have survived. But Joseph lands on his feet, going through the hardships that he goes through. The same could be said of Moses, of David, or Daniel, and others in the Bible who were faithfully walking with God, being blessed by God. But we also need to be aware that there are others in the Bible who were faithfully walking with God who did not reflect the same type of blessing. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, comes to mind. Job comes to mind. So this is not a health and wealth blessing. Another one that comes to mind just hit me. Stephen, Acts chapter 7. This is not a health and wealth type of blessing. This doesn't mean if you're obedient to God, you're going to be successful in everything that you do. Doesn't mean that God's going to bless you with making a lot of money. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be healthy, live to be 105 years old. It does mean that God's going to be with you. He's going to comfort you. He's going to take care of you. He's going to provide for you all the days of your life. We need to see God's blessings in a balanced biblical view, whereas blessings could mean health, success, or it could just be comfort and teaching us more and more about Him. The second thing to note is for God's people, temptation will always be a reality. There ain't no doubt about that one, folks. The Bible teaches us the primary purpose for allowing us to be tempted by Satan has to do with testing. The test is whether we'll be true to God, what God wants us to do or not. Many times, before God can use you greatly, He's going to tempt you, test you just as great. If you think back to Matthew 4. Was Matthew 4. I got Mark 1 too. Jesus going into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan before he starts his public ministry. And at each point, Satan's temptation, Jesus resisted. And throughout the four Gospels, Jesus tells his disciples to pray in order to resist temptation. There's a few observations about temptation we can take away from this passage about Joseph. One is temptation often comes during times of success. One of the characteristics of most Christians is that when things are difficult, we are pretty good in our prayer lives. We see our need for God in times of difficulty more so than we do in times of success or peace. And I've said this before. Too many people see God like a bottle of medicine. When you're sick, you get the medicine, you take your medicine. That's your prayer life. That's being close to God. When you get well, what do? You put the bottle of medicine back in the cabinet and don't think about it again until you're sick again. That's not the way we should be. Temptation came to Joseph here when it looked like everything was running smoothly in Potiphar's house. For us, successful times or peaceful times of life, we tend to let our guards down. We tend, and for many, we're not as diligent in our prayer life. We're not as diligent in our Bible study, our devotional life. And believe me, I know how easy it is for this to happen. We must learn to be disciplined in our walk with God, and there are times when it helps to have a friend that you can go talk to. Say, hey, I'm going through a rough patch right now. I'm being tempted, and just someone to talk to. It could be a pastor. It could be your spouse, if you're comfortable with that. But we are never going to outgrow temptation as long as we're alive on this planet. Temptation comes when we're in a place where no one knows us, when we are away from home. No one in Egypt had a clue who David was, or Joseph was. So giving in to temptations would have been easy. The same is true for us. When we're away from home and no one knows us, it would be easy for us to do whatever we want. Temptation will almost come your way at times when you're away from home. We live in a city that makes billions of dollars each year with that temptation. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Perhaps when I think about this, about being away, traveling, because I used to travel. My first 12 years of marriage, first 12 years out of college, I was on the road, drove 50,000 miles a year. So I've slept out a lot. I know what it's like to be away from home. I always think about perhaps the most respected minister of our day, or of our lifetime, and that's Billy Graham. Billy Graham had a code of conduct that he followed throughout his ministry. It involved money, it involved travel, it involved everything dealing with integrity and character, and being true to God's calling upon his life. And many ministers have adopted a similar code of conduct as Billy Graham had. If you want to read a pretty interesting book about that, and I can't remember the exact title. I have the book, but I can't remember the exact title. It's an ethics book by Billy Graham. Pretty good. But one of the things that impressed me when I first heard it, and actually have tried to do it since I learned about it, is with all of his travels around the world, Billy Graham never stayed in a motel room by himself. Either his wife was with him, or he had one of his staff that would stay in the same motel room with him. Did not want to put the temptation that all of us face before him. So we need to build that kind of accountability in our lives. Another thought on this, even if you're miles away from home, is you never know who's watching. I can't tell you the number of times my wife and I have been on vacation and run into church members or people we knew from different places. It's happening in airports in Europe and England. It's happening in South Africa. We're on a beach. Phone rings. Hey, we're here too. You want to go get something to eat? But the scariest one to me was when the kids were in high school, we took them to Playa del Carmen in the Mexican Riviera. We get on the plane. We look around. There's 2 church families on the plane with us. We didn't know they were going. We get to our resort. There's 3 church families at our resort that we didn't know were going. And none of them knew that each other were going. You never know who's watching. My wife and I ate at Cheesecake Factory for lunch today. She was out and about and knew I had to do this tonight, so I ate a late lunch dinner. So she's there before I get there, so I find her in Cheesecake Factory, and I sit down and look up. There's church members in the booth next to us. Can't get away from you people. You just never know. Speaking about you never know who's watching. First church I worked in, it was blowing and going like crazy. We were running about, probably 600 when I got there. It was only a 7-year-old church. And so I came on staff, and before we left, we were running well over 1,400, averaging over 1,400 a week. Built a new church, campus, whole bit. I had a phone call one day. One of your deacons cussed me out at Walmart. I said, what? So I called the deacon. Yeah, I got a little angry. Well, you never know who's watching. Got another phone call. One of your church members got kicked out of the girls' basketball game last night. I said, one of the kids? No, one of the parents. I knew the parent really well. Her son was my son's age. I called her. I said, what happened? The trainer on the other team kept teasing me, and I lost it with her. You never know who's watching. What kind of testimony was that about our church when I have church people being kicked out of ball games and cussing people out at Walmart? You never know who's watching. Another thing about temptation that we need to understand is just like Potiphar's wife was, it is persistent. Temptations are always persistent. Satan believes that he can weaken us by being persistent. One of the things that I've noticed as I've aged is some of the things that used to tempt me when I was younger, not that big a deal anymore. And some of the things that were younger that I would see didn't bother me too much, but as I'm older, they kind of bother me. Satan knows us so well. He knows which buttons to push. And he believes that he can wear us down by being persistent to get us off track and keep us from walking in a close relationship with God. Another thing about temptation is we need to remember God's counsel and God's promise about temptation. Proverbs 14:16 says, a wise person is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is arrogant and careless. Paul also addresses this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 through 13. These things happen to them as examples. Judah's a good example. Joseph's a good example for us to consider. As examples were written down as warnings to us, in whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. That's a good word right there. But when you're tempted, he will provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. One of the great things about God is he's not going to let us be tempted beyond what he knows you and I can handle. And when we're tempted, He's going to give us a way out if we're smart enough to take it. Too many of us aren't. And like I said earlier, it could be changing channels, turning off your TV, your computer, your phone, or it could be like Joseph did, and you just have to run away. He always gives us a way out. Then one more is you got to know who you are. Joseph knew who he was. He was a servant and not the master of the house. He was not this woman's husband. He was entrusted with everything in the house, but yet he knew she wasn't part of his responsibility. One of Satan's favorite tricks is to convince us we deserve more than, and that somehow we've been shortchanged in life. The advertising industry makes billions of dollars off of this lie, trying to convince us that you just need this product or that product to have arrived. And it's all a lie. And people are in debt up to their eyeballs trying to live up to the lie. We need to remember our status comes, just as Joseph knew, from our relationship with God and not from men. Kind of same type of thing. We need to recognize sin for what it is. Joseph recognized that had he given in to this woman, it would have been a sin against God. One of the games the devil plays is getting society to rename sins as well as normalize and desensitize us to what sin really is. Extramarital affairs were once called adultery. You don't hear that too much anymore. Some white-collar crimes were once called embezzlement or grand larceny. Homosexuality is now alternate lifestyle. And so the game that he plays with us is to get us to be desensitized to what sin is. Sometimes that's culture changing the name of what sin is. And so we got to be aware of that. And we got to have our spiritual radar turned on so we can recognize sin for being sin. And this next one I really like. I read this one, so this is not mine. I got this from somebody else, from one of the writers I read. This is good. Joseph lived with a made-up mind. Think about that. Joseph had made his mind up. He was going to be true to God no matter what. Folks, that's an easy one. Each one of us can live with a made-up mind that we're going to refuse when temptation comes. His mind was made up he wasn't going to sin against God. We need the same type of resolution in our lives today. When we live life like that, with a made-up mind, we don't live as reactionaries, basically reacting to the various things that go on around us, because we know whose we are. We're God's. The last thing was Joseph shows about the benefits of being a faithful steward. Each and every one of us in this room are stewards of what God has blessed us with. It could be health, it could be time, it could be experience, spiritual gifts, money, resources, all kinds of things. Everything in your life you're a steward of. Joseph showed what being a good steward was, the benefits of it. And God was with him, and God blessed him and took care of him in all that he does. Well, for us, it may not be financial, but he will be with us, and he will bless us when we're faithful stewards to him.